And thank you again. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Get a sip of water. We'll get going here. So as I looked at the calendar and started to consider what we would be talking about for the rest of the year, and usually in December we are talking about mysticism and the mystical experience. What is the true meaning of the Christ? What is the true meaning of Christmas? What is the meaning of all of the different rituals and ceremonies that different religions and cultures have around the solstice? And what occurred to me is I can't believe it's been a year since we did this last. It just seems like it was only a couple of weeks ago. In January we'll go back to the basics. We'll go back and ask ourselves, what do we believe about God? And we're going to ask ourselves again, how far do I think I've come in a year's time with regard to my spiritual growth, and how far do I want to go in the year? And we did that last January, and now it's time for us to start to reflect and say, did I grow as much as I wanted to? Did I experience the love and the presence to a greater degree than I did the year before? Is spiritual growth, is this awakening, this enlightenment, the surrender to the presence, is this truly the most important thing in my life? And we have to consider that. We've been created in the image and likeness of the divine, which means we can think and we can have consciousness, and we do have consciousness. And there's a power in the universe that responds to us according to our belief. But it's up to us to choose. It's up to us to decide. No one can do that for us. No one can make us happy. No one can make us sad. It's up to us to choose to react and respond in a way that is happy or as a way that is sad. Nobody can do our spiritual growth for us. We can have people who help us along the way. We can have people who inspire us along the way, who teach us along the way, who are willing to know for us at a time when we are unable to know for ourselves the perfection within. But in the end result, this is something that each and every one of us has to do for ourselves. No one else can do it for us. So we want to look a little bit as we move into December, just to kind of give you a view for where we're going. We've got 3 weeks before Christmas and then 1 week after. And the last week of the year, the week after Christmas, is always peace. We always talk about peace, the peace that passes understanding. Just before Christmas, we take a look at the metaphysical interpretation of the Christmas narratives. And what do they mean? What do they mean to us today? Then next week, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at what is the meaning of the Christ. What is this thing, the Christ? What does it mean? Is it a person? Is it a state of mind? What just exactly do we mean by that? And of course, this week, what we want to do is set all that up, and we want to look at, are you ready for the light? Are you ready for the season? When I was a kid growing up, the 40 days before Christmas were referred to as Advent. We had to prepare. We had to prepare ourselves for the Christmas season. And there's, in that idea, I think there is some truth that the presence of the divine is always here. It is always now. It is always with us. It is always around us. But we don't always see it. We don't always experience it. We don't always recognize it. Joel Goldsmith is one of my favorite modern mystics, and he says it very bluntly. He says, it's easy to say that God is peace and God is love and God is everywhere. Well, if God is peace and God is love and God is everywhere, then why don't we experience peace and love everywhere? Why is there war? Why are there crimes? Why is there hatred? If God is peace and God is love, and God must be right there where these things are going on. And his answer was also very blunt. He says, the reason that we don't experience the peace and the love of God, which is there, is because we don't realize it. Right? And it's not just an intellectual realization. It is a realization of the experience. We have not fully, or as fully as we can, we have not prepared ourselves for that realization. We have not prepared ourselves to receive the gifts that have been given. And what we want to talk a little bit today about different cultures and what this season means, and what are we talking about preparing ourselves, and how do we go about that, and of course, why is that important? So we're going to start with just a little bit of consideration of what's going on in world cultures at this time of the year. And of course, this time of the year refers to the winter solstice. And what that means is that right now, the days where we live are getting shorter. And they will continue to get shorter until the solstice, which is around the 21st December. And then after that, the days will start to grow longer again. And for the ancients, for people who spent time outside, for people whose livelihood depended upon the cycles of life here on earth, this is a very significant event. This is extremely significant. All of life on earth depends upon physical light. 2% of the light from the sun actually arrives at the surface of the earth. And that 2%, the energy of that 2% of the sun's sunlight, sustains every bit of life as we know it on earth. If it weren't for the sun, there would be no life. The life as we know it would come to an end. So for people who depended upon growing crops that needed the sunlight to grow, who depended upon raising animals that depended upon the crop in order to grow, if there was no light, there was no life. Very important. And these folks were very, very aware. They're very aware of the cycles of life. And at the time of the solstice, at the time of the winter solstice, there are different rituals and different celebrations in different cultures to kind of acknowledge that. Now, we in our modern, we like to call ourselves modern. I don't know sometimes that we're as sophisticated as we think we are. But in our view of looking back in time, we tend to look down upon the ancient people as being superstitious and full of ignorance and all these kind of things. And I think that's what the psychologists today call downward social comparison. We make ourselves feel better about ourselves by putting other people down. That's goes on in our society a lot. And we tend to look back at ancient people's ideas of God and of religion, and we immediately dismiss it as being superstition and just fear and those sorts of things. And of course, there may be some truth in some of that, but not in all of that. Certainly not in all of that. If we stop and think, some of the scriptures that have the greatest influence on our cultures are 4,000 or 5,000 years old. So this is wisdom that has come to us from very ancient times. And where did the ancient people get this wisdom from? Who knew 4,000 years ago how to write these things down? They must have been some very, very deep thinkers. Must have been some people who were very open to inspiration, to allow this truth to come through in a manner that's sustained for all of these years. So when some people look at the solstice celebrations, they look at the ancient people go out and build bonfires and await the solstice, and we still do to this day. There are places all around the country where there are solstice celebrations, and people go out and hold big bonfires. They sustain a ritual that's been with us since before we know. But sometimes the modern writers will look on that and say, well, this was superstition. See, what was happening is people were scared to death that the sun wasn't going to come back, that the days were getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and if the sun didn't come back, why, life as they knew it would end. They would starve to death. Their crops would die. Their animals would die. Their families would die. So what they did was they went out to a high point and they built this big fire, and they were trying to show the gods in heaven what they needed, that they needed light, and the gods were going to send them the light. And if we don't stop and think about it, we can say, oh, well, that makes sense. But see, there was much more to it than that. There was much more to it than it. And the people had to know the sun was coming back. How would they know what day to go out and build their fire? Just think about it. Why did they pick just that one particular day? Well, they knew it was coming back. See, they knew that they were connected to the cycle of life. And I choose to look at what's going on instead of a superstitious ritual where people were trying to force God to send the light back. See, I tend to look at it as people who realize their connectedness. They realize their oneness. They understood. They understood that they were part of a cycle much bigger than they were. Right? They probably didn't understand the mechanical workings of the cycle, but they understood that they were part of something that was changing, something that was moving from fall to winter. But as sure as that sun was coming back, as sure as the day after the solstice was even a second longer than the day before, it meant that they were still connected. They were still connected to that great cycle of life. Because if the solstice comes, the spring comes, the animals will give birth, the crops can be sown, and there's another harvest coming. I said a couple of weeks ago, if you're holding an acorn in your hand, what are you holding? Is it something that might become an oak tree, or something that is an oak tree in the form of an acorn? See, and it's already done. It's an oak tree in the form of an acorn is what we have. It's never going to be more of an oak tree than it is at the time that you're holding it in your hand. It's just going to be bigger. It's going to look different, but it's going to be still an oak tree. And you're not only holding that oak tree, but you're holding all of the acorns from it, and all of the acorns from all of the trees that it produces. And you're holding an entire forest in your hand, because there is a cycle of life that is at work. And if we can just realize our connectedness with it, if we can realize our connection, and we can understand that if the daylight is just 1 second more than it was the day before, that everything else unfolds perfectly. And I believe that the ancient people, that they understood this. I think we understand it if they didn't, but I certainly do believe that they did understand it. And I think that the different religions, the different cultures, the different rituals, and the different celebrations stay with us until this day, because that symbolism is so powerful. It is just something that is so powerful that people need to react and respond to it. There are certain things in our cycle of life. There are certain times that just cry out for an acknowledgement, that even when one culture overtakes another culture, whether it be through merging or through war or something like that, the holidays remain. And they may change their names, but the holidays remain. In the ancient times, around the beginning of May, they had the May Day celebrations, and they had the maypole dances, which was a fertility dance. And then later on, other cultures and other religions came along, and in Catholicism, it became the feast of Mary. In communist cultures, it became Workers' Day. But there's something about that time of the year. You see, there's something about that people have this natural desire to get together and have some sort of a celebration. And the solstice is one of those times in the year. People can't do much out in the fields. They can't work outside too much. It's too cold. They're kind of indoors, with the harvest that they had taken in the previous months. And they have the Yule log burning. They have the big thick log burning, and they've got time together. They've got time with family. So it's a natural time for celebration. So I think we have to go back and we have to look at this time of the year, this season, and ask ourselves, well, what is it that's going on here? What is it that people are doing here? Look at the different cultures. In Judaism, we have Hanukkah, the Festival of the Lights, and it marks a time when a miracle, when the people felt that the presence of God was with them, and it was demonstrated to them because the oil that was going to burn in the menorah, in the candles, in the lamps, was only supposed to last 7 days, but it lasted 8. It lasted until the new supply came. Right? So the symbolism there is, as I see it, the symbolism there is an acknowledgement of the presence of God with us, with the people. It is right there. It is visible. It is visible for us to see. It is tangible. We move into the ideas of Christianity, and Jesus is referred to as the light of the world. So here we have the light coming into the world at the same time as the solstice, but it's a different kind of light. It's not the physical light. It is the same symbolism as I see in the festival of Hanukkah. It is the very presence of God visible with us right here and right now. See, and in other cultures there, in Hinduism, we have festivals of lights, and as I say, in the cultures that we would now refer to as the agrarian cultures or the pagan cultures, there's this celebration of the solstice. So there's this idea at the physical level, there's this idea that light is returning. The days have been getting shorter, and now they're getting longer. And at the physical level, that means that we are provided for. It means that our crops will have sunlight to grow. Our animals will have sunlight to grow. But at the spiritual level, there's a deeper meaning. That we are connected to the very source, to the very substance of life. That it is in our midst and in our presence. And we just have to take our time to prepare ourselves to receive it. Here's an example of how, when we look at other cultures, we look back, we tend not to understand the deepness, the depth of the people's feeling of the presence, feeling of connectedness. In Egypt, there was a cult. We refer to it as a cult, and of course, we refer to anything we don't understand when it comes to religion as a cult, right? In practical use, the word cult means a religion that I don't understand. So in Egypt, there was an ancient religion, and the people worshipped the cow. We, our modern scientists, would say they worshiped the cow. But the cow was certainly a central part of their religion. Whether they were worshiping the cow or what the cow symbolized is something that we need to explore. But the temple was built in the shape of the cow. And when the people entered the temple, they were entering the cow. They were going into the cow. And Joseph Campbell tells us if we explore that deeper, we can look at that and say, well, isn't that superstitious? These people, their God was a cow. What kind of religion is that? And Campbell was telling us, no, you have to understand how important the cow was to their society and what a miraculous animal the cow was. You give the cow grass and it produces milk. How does it do that? How does it know to do that? What is this miracle that takes place within inside the body of the cow that allows it to take ordinary grass and produce the milk that not only sustains its own young, but sustains our young as well? The cow's body also produces the calf, and how does it do that? What miracle takes place within inside the body of the cow that allows it to produce that calf, and when that calf is born, excuse me, the milk it needs to drink is already ready and waiting for it. See, life provides for us before we even ask, before we even need. So the people who participated, the people who were involved in this religion had a deep sense of being connected to life. See, not only was the calf connected to the cow, but the young children who drank the cow's milk were connected to the cow, and through the miracle of the cow, our babies are able to take grass and get milk and grow. And there's this deeper sense of being one with. Excuse me. I've had a cold for a week and it's really getting to me. So it's this deeper sense of connectedness that we can even see in an ordinary cow. Now you've heard me talk, about how our religious ideas kind of evolve, and we go through these different phases. And at the first level of organized thought and organized religion, everything is about behavior. The Ten Commandments are about behavior. Do this, don't do that. And people's idea of their religion and their God is this one of separation, that God is far away, out there somewhere, and that we are down here somewhere, wherever down here happens to be. And that we must behave in a certain way in order to get God to give to us that which we need to live, right? It is our behavior that is important. And that is why we have in the Orthodox or fundamentalist teachings, we have so many rules and regulations. Someone went back and counted in the Old Testament and claims that there are 611 different things that a good person must either do or not do, right? Some of them are positive, you have to do this. Some of them are negative, don't do that. There are 611 different things that people must do each day if they were to fulfill all of the requirements that are put on them by the Old Testament. And of course, that's impossible. It's impossible. I don't know if you're into to-do lists, but can you imagine having a to-do list with 611 different things on there? If I get the top 3 or 4 on my priority list done every day, when I was in corporate America, I was doing good. Now, mind you, I handled 8 million interruptions while I was doing that. But if I could stay focused and get the top 3 or 4 priorities done in a day's time, that was a good day for me. Can you imagine trying to have 611 different things that you're trying to keep track of? So this idea that we have, then of course that leads to a tremendous amount of guilt, right? None of us can do that, and yet if we take literally that teaching, then we believe that we must, but we can't, and we feel bad about that. We feel guilty about that. So in that way of thinking, in that level 1 way of thinking, God is out there and we are down here, and our behavior is what influences God's opinion of us, and we must do or not do certain things in order to get God to give us what we need. Again, excuse me. Then you can see how this idea of, well, we must go out and light a fire and burn a fire on a certain day in order to ensure that the light is going to come back, right? In order to ensure that God is going to give us what we need. And that I can understand as, superstitious, magical thinking, superstitious, that God might not send us the light this year because we haven't been so good. I guess it's kind of the pre-Santa Claus lump of coal in the stocking. We're not going to get our gifts. We're going to get punished instead. But what happens to folks as we start to mature spiritually? And this doesn't have anything to do with the evolution of time. This doesn't have to do with human history, because very clearly there were people thousands of years ago who had kind of moved through the spiritual evolution, who had moved through spiritual growth. They gave us the scriptures that we have. They gave us the teachings that we have. They gave us the examples that we have. So it's not a matter of how old we are or what modern times we live in. It is a matter of, have we dedicated ourselves to our growth? Have we listened to the call within of our hearts that are telling us to prepare, to get ready to receive? So as human consciousness evolves, there are people who come to the realization, well, maybe this idea, this idea of the sun, maybe this idea of the solstice, maybe there's a deeper meaning here for us. It's no longer feasible at that level to consider that God is going to withhold the sunlight from all people as a matter of punishment. So this idea about the solstice, this idea about the sun, this idea of the days growing longer, perhaps it has a deeper significance to us, and we should explore that. And that's when we start to get into the ideas that I mentioned, that we are connected one with all life. That the light, the physical light that comes to us, provides for all of the life on earth. But where does that light come from? You see? What is the source of the light? What are we talking about here? It must mean something deeper. In the book of Genesis, we're told that the very first thing that God created was light. On the very first day, God created light. But if you're a fan of old movies like I am, you'll remember Inherit the Wind, the Scopes Monkey trial, Inherit the Wind, and they had the dramatic courtroom scene, and Clarence Darrow was the lawyer for the teacher who was accused of teaching evolution. I can't remember the name of the man who was prosecuting. He was very famous as well. And they're having this great battle in the courtroom, about the Bible is literally accurately true, that the earth is only 5,000 years old, and all of the things that we hear going on now in the battle of evolution versus creationism in our schools. And in a dramatic moment in the screenplay, they have Clarence Darrow asking, and he says, when did God create light? And they said, well, God created light on the first day. And he says, well, when did God create the sun and the moon? He says, well, God created the sun and the moon on the fourth day. So, oh, well, if we measure a day by the sun going around us once, then those first 4 days, they could have been a bazillion years long, right? And this is the way that they end the movie. Yes, of course, that's it. You can't take that part to be literally true, because there was no sun and no moon there for the first 4 days. And while that may work as a dramatic device for a screenplay, we have to ask ourselves the same question. Well, wait a second. If light was created on the first day and the sun and the moon weren't created to the fourth day, now I'm not saying that this is literally true. I'm saying we have to consider what this means. Is the light that was created on the first day the same kind of light that was created on the fourth day when the sun and the moon came in and the stars came into being? And in the Aramaic, the word for light means enlightenment. The word that was used in the first day God created light is enlightenment, is consciousness. It is awakening. See, the first and most important part of creation is consciousness. It is enlightenment. It is awakening. So now if we go back and we start to look at this whole business of the solstice, if we start to look at it from our level 2 lens, from our lens of saying, well, what does this mean with our intellect? What does this mean? What is the deeper connection here? What can we make of this? Now we can say, perhaps the deep stirring within the human soul to stop and recognize this time of the year. Perhaps the deep stirring is our desire to awaken, our desire to experience enlightenment, our desire to experience, excuse me, excuse me, our desire to experience the love and the presence of God. There's a part of us that knows our connection. There's a part of us that has never forgotten that connection. You know, in some of the ancient teachings, they tell a story of when the gods created men. They had something very valuable that they didn't want men to find. And the gods had this discussion about where they should hide it. And one said, well, let's put it down at the very depths of the ocean. And another god said, no. They're eventually they're going to want to go down there and take a look, see what's down there. They'll find it. And another one said, well, let's put it up on the top of the highest mountain. And another god said, no. So, you know, their curiosity, someday just because it's there, they'll want to climb it. And they will go up to the top of the mountain. They'll find it. And they're thinking, and they say, where can we hide this most valuable thing that human beings won't look for it? And they said, we'll put it within them. They'll never look there. So we tend to accept the fact that all of our senses point outward. The eyes, the ears, everything points outward. And yet there's something within us, and we know it's there. And as Meister Eckhart said, it's like the child playing hide and seek. Every once in a while it clears its voice, clears its throat, so we can find it. There's this inner presence that is calling to us, to awaken to it, to allow it to grow within us so that we might experience more of it and it might experience more of its own life as us. We know it's there. We sometimes try to pretend that it's not there. Or we try to pretend that it's not time for us to awaken to it. You know, it's Augustine, I believe, who said, "Oh God, make me good, but not yet." We know that it is tugging on our heartstrings. And there comes a time when we have to answer the call. We have to open ourselves up to receive it. And perhaps at this level of consciousness, this is what the solstice means to us, is that we are preparing to receive the light, but not the physical light, the enlightenment light, the awareness light, the awakening light, the presence of God light. And of course that would lead us into the mystical level of consciousness, that when we have the experience of this light, this cosmic consciousness, as Richard Maurice Buck called it, being blinded by the light is kind of something that people use to describe a sudden awakening. Paul was knocked off the horse on the way to Damascus. He was blinded by the light. And if you read into those scriptures, what was it that he saw? He had the vision of the Christ, the vision of the presence of the divine. So all throughout history, all throughout Scripture, we have different examples of people who have had the mystical experience. There was Elijah rode to heaven in a chariot of fire. His consciousness was raised into the mystical experience. Moses had the burning bush experience, the mystical experience. All throughout history, all throughout Scripture, we are being told that there is another reality, another experience, the experience of the presence of God. And if we stop and think about our spiritual growth, if we stop and try to think about it in terms of beginning, middles, and ends, which probably is not a good example, but it is an example. And the reason I say it's not good is because there's no end. It is beyond anything that we can comprehend. Everything that we know in this physical life has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The spiritual life had no beginning, has no end. So the analogies we use are always less than adequate. But if we can consider our time here on earth, and we can consider our our spiritual growth here on earth, as far as we can tell at this time, what the best result that we could hope for is to be in this mystical presence, is to live in this mystical experience, the enlightenment, the awakening. Rumi talks about the desire of the moth to unite with the flame, even though the moth is completely consumed by the flame. The moth is compelled to fly into the flame for that moment of bliss, for that moment of unity, for that experience of oneness. And there is that within us that craves that experience of the presence of God, craves that unity, craves that mystical experience. So if we can consider that we come to this place called Earth, and we are here, and we begin learning rules of behavior, we have to recognize that they are very important because they teach us discipline. And by discipline I mean being able to do what needs to be done when it needs to be done. That's what I mean by discipline. So pretty much what these rules of behavior that we learn at the beginning of our journey are telling us is that you have to do what needs to be done when it needs to be done, or there are consequences. And sometimes there are good consequences, and sometimes there are not so good consequences. If you do what needs to be done when it needs to be done, the consequences are good. If you don't do it, the consequences are not so good. And this is not in the form necessarily of some outside force punishing or rewarding us, although that's the way we respond to it at that level of consciousness. We come to realize later on that it is pretty much we who are bringing the situations to ourselves because of the way that we interact with the law of mind, with the power of consciousness. As Dr. Holmes would tell us, if you turn a burner on the stove, if you put your hand on it, you're going to get burned. But it's not the stove's fault. It's the way that we used it. So as we start to grow, we eventually start to realize, now, wait a second. Life is a matter of consciousness, and it is done unto me according to my belief. And all of these different laws and commandments that I learned were really telling me about my belief and what would happen if I didn't believe properly. But the way that I was taught, the way that I learned at that level of consciousness to kind of move through that was to learn my spiritual practice, to learn how to pray. And as we continued to grow, we started to realize, well, what do we mean by prayer? There are effective prayers and there are ineffective prayers. And people have many different ways to pray, and they use that word prayer the same. Everybody says, well, pray for me. Well, I'll send you a prayer and all of these things. But what do we mean by that? What is the purpose of prayer? What is the technique of prayer? How do I do my spiritual practice? And as we have evolved in our consciousness, our prayer has evolved from a begging, a pleading, a beseeching of some power out there to an awareness that what we are doing is attuning our own consciousness to something that already is. We are setting in motion the power that responds to us according to our belief by attuning our consciousness, becoming consciously aware of what we believe. Rocco Errico tells us that in the Aramaic the word for prayer was an attunement, and it was kind of a setting a trap. He refers to the Lord's Prayer as setting a trap for God. What we are doing is we are tuning and aligning our consciousness to that which is already there, so that we receive and we capture, if you want to call it that, the good that has already been given, the experience of the presence which has already been promised. So we learn a technique and we learn a different form of prayer and a different way of prayer. But if we don't have the discipline to pray, it does us no good. I was listening to a talk on the radio yesterday. I only caught part of it, but the person being interviewed was she gives talks at TED Talks, and she was a former nun who left the convent. She was very unhappy in the convent. She left the convent, and she went to school at Cambridge University. She's English, and she then became a historian of religions. She studied world religions. And it was through her academic work that she started to see the theme that ran through all religions. For her, it was a theme of compassion, and she became very excited about teaching compassion. Kind of an interesting journey. Excuse me. But one thing she said during the interview that struck me was the interviewer asked her, well, why did you leave the convent? And she said, well, a nun's life is only as good as her prayer life, and my prayer life was terrible. And I thought to myself, well, isn't it true for all of us that our life is really only as good as our prayer life? So we have to have that discipline to prepare to receive the light. We can come to the realization that this idea of what's going on in this season, at this time of the year, is really a stirring within the human soul, within all of our souls, within our psyche. There is something stirring within us that says we must prepare ourselves to receive the light. But the light is not the physical light. It is the metaphysical light, the enlightenment, the awakening. There is part of us that says, the stirring in my heart this year, I wish to respond more fully than I perhaps have ever before. I wish to respond, to allow this light which has created me out of itself to manifest itself more fully. And in order to do that, we have to do our spiritual practice. We have to take our time to set aside for prayer, which we call treatment, for our meditation, which are different forms. There's single focus meditation, there's contemplative meditation, and then there's the just be still and know kind of meditation. We have a practice of visualization where we take time to to bring ourselves into a visual acknowledgement of the growth we wish to experience, of the type of life we wish to lead. And we have spiritual practice of affirmation, which we continually remind ourselves of the truth as a way of shaking up that within our consciousness which doesn't agree with it, so that that disbelief can leave us. So we have the tools in our toolbox, and the question then becomes, are we using them? Are we using them? I remember at Asilomar one year, Dr. Dennis Merritt Jones asked the audience, raise your hand if you have a special room in your house to clean your body. And of course, everybody said, yeah, of course, we got a bathroom, we got a shower. Of course, we got a special room. He said, okay, now raise your hand if you have a special room in your house to clean your mind. And of course, the number of hands that went up was significantly less. And the point that he was making is that what's more important? What's more important in the eternal scheme of things? What's more important? Is it washing the physical body, or is it taking time to immerse our consciousness in the presence of God, in ideas of God, in the feeling of God? And of course, it is the latter that is the most important, truly most important. So what I'm inviting everyone to do as we go forward this month in another season of preparing for Christmas and understanding what the Christ means and understanding what it means to us to accept into our experience the presence of the divine, I invite you to reflect upon your daily spiritual activity and ask yourself if you are ready to receive the light, if you are doing your daily practice, if you are reading your inspirational literature, if you're listening to inspirational talks, if you are taking time every day to set into motion the power that responds to you according to your belief, to direct it to increase your desire to experience God, to increase your discipline to do the things that need to be done. Can you take some time during the day to just simply be still? Simply know. Simply invite the presence of the divine. Goldsmith tells us, it's great if we can sit down and do this at 30-minute intervals several times a day, but if we can't, can you stop in between phone calls? Just for a moment, can you stop and acknowledge the presence of God within? Can we take time to see the life that we would live, to see the unfoldment, to see ourselves growing spiritually every day? And can we remind ourselves through affirmations of that truth that we truly, truly want to experience? But we also understand that we may not quite be ready yet, so the affirmations help us to get there. So this is a magical time of the year. It is a mystical time of the year. It is a time, if we will get away from the materialism and the department stores and Black Fridays and get away from all of those things, if we can stop and say, this is a time to prepare my soul for my next year of growth. This is a time to prepare my soul for a greater experience of God. The love of God is ready, willing, and able. It is already here. It is already now. But it requires our cooperation. We have the tools. We know how to use them. And the only question is, are you ready to receive the light? And I trust that your answer is yes. So it is.